Resuming debate, the honourable member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be sharing my time today with the member from London Fanshawe. I'd like to thank the honourable member from Nanaimo Ladysmith for introducing the motion before us in the House of Commons today, which is so worthy of our collective attention and action. The motion tabled by my colleague is quite lengthy, but in summary, it calls on the government to recognize pay equity as a fundamental human right, implement the recommendations of the 2004 Pay Equity Task Force report, restore the right to pay equity in the public service, and strike a special committee of MPs to conduct hearings on pay equity and propose proactive pay equity legislation. Since the federal election, there has been a lot of talk about how this government will fix some of the damage done by a decade of Conservative government. The sad truth of the matter is that the previous Conservative government turned back the clock on pay equity with support from the Liberals. Today is an opportunity to move forward in the right direction by finally working to ensure equal pay for work of equal value. I'd like to begin my remarks by discussing the challenge before us today. The gap in wages between women and men is real, persistent, and widespread. There are several ways of measuring the problem. One way is to compare the annual earnings of women and men. Statistics Canada tells us that in 2008, the annual earnings of women were 64.4% of their male counterparts. One explanation for this is that women are more likely to work part-time hours than men. Another way to compare earnings is by looking at the annual earnings of only full-time workers, which tells us that in 2008, Canadian women working the full year, full-time, earned on average 71% as much as their male counterparts. And in median terms, women earn just 76 cents on the dollar. Now, this figure can be skewed by a small number of people who earn extremely high salaries. For example, we know that approximately 80% of corporate board seats are held by men, according to a study done last year by Catalyst. So a third way of measuring the gender wage gap is by looking at hourly wages, which shows that women aged 25 to 54 earn about 85% as much per hour as their male counterparts. As in non-unionized workplaces, the gap drops to 79%, while in unionized jobs, the gap is 94%. Women in Canada are joining unions at a high rate, and it's no surprise that they are seeking jobs where pay equity is ensconced in collective agreements. Whichever way one chooses to measure the gender pay gap, it's there, it's real, and in many ways, it's getting worse. I've already touched on some of the factors that contribute to this stubborn wage gap. More women than men work part-time. More women work in lower wage occupations and industries. Women are 60% of minimum wage workers, despite making up half of the Canadian workforce. Raising the minimum wage, as the NDP proposed to do federally, would help raise the bar for women, as would implementing a national affordable childcare program. Statistics also tell us that about 2/3 of the female workforce is concentrated in teaching, nursing and healthcare, office and administrative work, and sales and service industries. It's not enough to say the wage gap exists because women make career choices related to work-family balance. Many occupations considered women's work have been underpaid compared with so-called men's jobs because of a historical undervaluing of women's skills and work. A Toronto Star editorial published in 2014 makes a comparison between licensed practical nurses, where 90% of the workplace is female, and cable TV service and maintenance technicians, where the workforce is 97% male. LPNs are better educated and more skilled, but have a median earnings of about $38,000 per year, compared to $51,000 for the technicians. Look at early childhood educators and assistants. In 2010, their average wage was about $22,000. We also know that the wage gap exists for well-educated women in top positions. In 2008, female university graduates earned $62,800 annually, while men earned $91,800. And top women executives at S&P 500 companies continue to be paid less, on average, than their male counterparts. From the lowest wage jobs to the highest, the gender wage gap persists. Internationally, Canada is one of the worst developed countries for pay equity. The World Economic Forum ranks us 80th out of 145 countries. Among the OECD countries, we rank 30th out of 34. What's even more embarrassing is that Canada's previous Prime Minister did not believe in pay equity at all, calling it a rip-off and ridiculous. And when his Conservative government brought forward a 2009 budget bill that weakened pay equity rules, gutted status of women of Canada in terms of both funding and mandate, the Liberal Party voted in support of the government's agenda. The day before the vote, the leader of the Liberal Party shrugged his shoulders and said to the media, "We've made it clear that we are not pursuing an amendment strategy. Sometimes we have to hold our nose." The question facing the Liberal government of today is quite clear. Do you agree it's time to stop holding your collective noses and move forward with real, tangible progress towards equality for women? Last month in Davos, the Prime Minister was lauded for calling himself a feminist and embracing gender equality. Now is the time to put words into action. I'm hopeful all parties in the House can work together to get proactive pay equity legislation in place so that we can achieve wage equality. The motion before the House today presents solutions to a problem I hope we can all agree exists and must be fixed. Thanks to the work of the Pay Equity Task Force over a decade ago, parliamentarians already have a clear roadmap for moving forward on achieving pay equity for women. The task force, struck in year 2000, was asked to examine pay equity and develop recommendations for improving the pay equity legislative framework in Canada. Over the course of several years, they held extensive consultations as well as public hearings, roundtables, and more. In 2004, the task force produced a comprehensive report which included over 100 recommendations related to legislation, collective bargaining, oversight, and enforcement. It recommended standalone, proactive pay equity legislation, which puts the onus on an employer to introduce a pay equity program, rather than relying on an individual or a union to pursue a complaint. Sadly, the Liberal government of the day failed to implement most of those recommendations. They acknowledged pay equity as a right and that proactive legislation is needed, but they failed to introduce the necessary legislation. The Liberals' failure to act was followed by a Conservative government that was ideologically opposed to proactive pay equity legislation. But the roadmap developed by the Pay Equity Task Force in 2004 still exists. And today's motion calls on the Liberal government to finally do the right thing and implement these recommendations. It's so important that we, as parliamentarians, commit ourselves to eliminating the gender wage gap. It's both a moral issue as well as a social and economic one. The wage gap translates into higher rates of poverty and greater retirement insecurity for women. It means foregoing important contributions to our local and national economies. In an era of slow economic growth, we simply cannot afford to ignore the wage gap. According to Eel Chernick, head of Mars Discovery District, one of the world's largest urban innovation hubs, Canada is in a global talent war. As a country with a modest population, we can't win unless all of our players are on the field. In addition to pay equity legislation, we can also tackle the gender wage gap by helping women and girls enter high-wage occupations, including STEM careers, where STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In the Windsor-Essex region, a recent video entitled "Because It's 2016" showcased local women working in STEM careers in an effort to highlight the opportunities available for women in these good-paying jobs. As an auto worker, I know what it means to work in a male-dominated field, and I know it'll take a lot of work to address the stereotypes, workplace policies, systemic discrimination, and other barriers that can prevent women from entering high-wage occupations. Mr. Speaker, it is 2016, and here in this place, women make up just 26% of elected representatives. Across Canada, women make 77 cents on the dollar compared to men. And internationally, our country ranks 30th out of 34 OECD countries for wage equality. We know pay equity and the fight for women's equality are issues that cross party lines. I challenge my colleagues from all parties to join together, vote yes to this motion, and let's finally move forward on achieving pay equity.